The night settles slowly over Victorian London, though the darkness seems never complete. Gas lamps sputter to life along crooked lanes, their hazy glow swallowed by a rolling tide of fog that drifts in from the river. This is no gentle mist, but a heavy, yellowish shroud, thick with coal smoke and damp with soot. The air tastes of iron and ash, and every breath feels like swallowing cinders. Yet the city does not sleep. From the wealthiest drawing rooms of Mayfair to the narrowest alleys of Whitechapel, life thrums beneath the veil. Carriages rattle over cobblestones, their wheels splashing through puddles fouled with refuse. A hawker's cry pierces the gloom, selling roasted chestnuts from a battered cart. In the distance, the bells of St. Paul's toll out the hour, their solemn chime muffled by the fog. Somewhere, a child coughs, and somewhere else, a drunken chorus rises from a gin shop. London at night is alive, restless, and contradictory, a place where grandeur and misery exist side by side. For the wealthy, the evening means flickering candlelight in drawing rooms, adorned with velvet drapes and gilt-edged mirrors. Servants glide silently across the polished floors, pouring wine, lighting lamps, arranging games of whist, or reading aloud from the latest serialized novel by Mr. Dickens. The fog outside is an inconvenience, perhaps an amusing subject of complaint, but nothing more. It cannot touch their tables heavy with roast fowl and puddings, their parlors perfumed with flowers brought in from the conservatory. Step outside those grand houses, however, and the city changes shape. The fog clings closer, carrying with it the stench of refuse, damp wood, and the faint sour tang of sewage that seeps from drains not yet tamed by modern engineering. Along the Strand, costermongers still call their wares, their voices muted, their baskets laden with bruised apples and fading greens. Men huddle in doorways, collars turned up, striking matches to light cheap pipes filled with coarse tobacco. Horses snort impatiently as drivers struggle to guide them through the murk. The beasts' flanks glistening with sweat in the dim glow of lanterns. To wander into the East End on such a night is to walk through another world entirely. The streets here are narrower, the alleys tighter, and the fog thicker still. Dim lamps throw weak halos on the wet stones, where refuse gathers in heaps and rainwater mixes with the filth of the gutters. Rookeries, those notorious, crumbling tenements, press in on either side, their windows broken or shuttered, their stairways steep and rotten. From behind thin walls come the muffled cries of children, the shouts of quarreling neighbors, or the rattle of someone struggling through a fever. Here life moves not in carriages, but on foot. A shoeless boy slips silently past, his quick fingers darting toward an unguarded pocket. A woman in a tattered shawl waits beneath a lamp, her eyes scanning the darkness for potential custom. Groups of laborers shuffle by, their boots leaving tracks in the mud, their shoulders sagging after 14 hours of toil at the docks or in the factories. Their pay may last only long enough for bread, a place in a lodging house, or perhaps a pint of gin to warm the blood against the chill. And always, the fog presses closer. It transforms every sound into an echo, every figure into a silhouette, every corner into a place of uncertainty. To those unused to it, the super is disorienting, even frightening. But to the Londoner, it is simply part of existence, as inevitable as the rising tide of the Thames. Children grow up learning to navigate by memory, by the pattern of cobblestones under their feet, or by the faint outlines of familiar doorways and spires. Yet the fog is more than weather. It is a character in its own right. Writers of the day describe it as sinister, as though the city itself conspires to conceal secrets within its folds. Thieves favor such nights, when the watchful eyes of constables are blinded. Lovers, too, steal moments in the shelter of misty corners. For some, the fog is a cloak, for others, a suffocating trap. One can imagine, on such an evening, a traveler new to London stepping down from the station platform. He would see only the nearest glow of lamps, hear only the muffled rumble of wheels, and feel the clammy dampness settle into his very bones. The vastness of the city would be hidden from him, its sprawl of millions reduced to the narrow slice of street before his eyes. And yet he would sense, in the restless shifting of shadows and the ceaseless noise of life behind the fog, that he stood in a place unlike any other in the world. In these early moments of our journey, we shall not hurry. Instead, we will linger here in the fog, watching it curl around lamp posts, drift into alleyways, and soften the outlines of the city. For this fog, oppressive as it may seem, is the very breath of Victorian London. It carries the soot of its factories, the smoke of its hearths, the sweat of its laborers, and the perfume of its parlors. To inhale it is to inhale the contradictions of an age, splendor and squalor, invention and exploitation, progress and despair. As the night deepens, the city does not fall silent. Somewhere a carriage clatters toward a late-night ball. Somewhere a factory whistle signals the end of another shift. Somewhere, in the darkness of Whitechapel, a figure walks alone, his footsteps muffled by the wet stones, his thoughts known only to himself. All of these lives, rich and poor alike, move within the same fog, their paths crossing, their destinies intertwined in ways seen and unseen. And so we begin, standing still within this dense, shifting veil, listening to the quiet heartbeat of a city, both terrible and beautiful. The fog descends, and with it, London reveals itself not in the bright clarity of day, but in the muted tones of night, mysterious, unsettling, yet strangely soothing. It is here, in this dim half-light, that our story unfolds. As the fog curls through the narrow alleys of London, it lingers longest in the places where the poor make their homes, the infamous slums known as rookeries. To step into one of these labyrinths is to enter a world almost hidden from the rest of the city, a place where daylight scarcely reaches and fresh air is but a memory. The buildings here lean precariously against one another, their timbers warped, their bricks crumbling, as if they might collapse with the next stiff wind. The streets between them are little more than passages, clogged with refuse and alive with rats. Whole families crowd into a single room, their possessions amounting to a straw mattress, a cracked pot, perhaps a wooden stool. Windows, if they exist at all, are small and often stuffed with rags to keep out the damp. In the summer, the air grows fetid, thick with the stench of rotting food, unwashed bodies, and open privies. In the winter, the cold gnaws through the thin walls, and frost creeps across the inside of the glass, where children huddle close for warmth. One of the most notorious rookeries lies in the East End, where Spitalfields and Whitechapel converge. Here, lodging houses cluster in every crooked lane, each one crammed with tenants who can spare only a few pennies for a night's rest. The lucky might claim a corner of a shared bed. The less fortunate make do with a space on the floor, shoulder to shoulder with strangers. Even poorer still are those who rent a four-penny coffin, a wooden box where one may lie down, or a two-penny hangover, where ropes are strung across a room, and the desperate rest by leaning forward, their arms draped over the cord. The sounds of the rookery are ceaseless. Babies cry through the night, arguments flare and fade as tempers, stoked by hunger or gin, erupt in quarrels. The rasp of a saw, the clang of a hammer, and the shuffle of feet echo through narrow courtyards where trades are plied. Costermongers sharpen knives, cobblers mend worn-out boots, and women wash laundry in murky tubs before hanging it in limp, grey strings overhead. Sanitation is almost non-existent. With no proper sewers, waste runs down gutters into open drains. Cesspools overflow, their contents seeping into the ground where children play barefoot. Diseases flourish in such conditions. Typhus, cholera, and diphtheria claim victims regularly, and consumption, the slow wasting illness known today as tuberculosis, lingers like a constant spectre. The parish authorities do what they can, but the scale of the misery overwhelms their efforts. To be poor in a rookery is to live always on the edge of catastrophe. And yet, within this hardship, life continues with a stubborn energy. Children dash through alleys in packs, inventing games from scraps of wood or discarded bottles. They know the shortcuts, the hidden doors, the loose bricks that conceal small treasures. Women barter fiercely in markets, stretching a few coins into meals that can feed many mouths. Men gather outside public houses, trading gossip, news of work, or rumors of better fortunes across the ocean. For all its misery, the rookery is also a community, bound together by necessity and survival. Visitors from wealthier districts sometimes come to gawk at the rookery, their curiosity piqued by lurid newspaper accounts of crime and squalor. Social reformers walk the lanes, appalled by what they see, taking notes in leather-bound books. Missionaries preach at the corners, offering bread and Bibles in equal measure. But once they leave, the rookery returns to its rhythms, untouched by outside judgment. Its residents know that few truly understand what it means to live here, and fewer still can change it. Consider, for a moment, the tenement of a widow named Mrs. Hargraves. Her husband was a docker, crushed under a crate 3 winters ago. Since then, she has taken in sewing, working from dawn until her eyes blur, yet earning just enough to pay the rent collector who comes each week. In her room live her 3 children. The eldest, Tom, works as a crossing sweeper, clearing horse droppings from the streets for pennies tossed by passing gentlemen. The middle child, Sarah, sells matches, while the youngest, little Nell, is too small to work at all. At night, the family huddles under a single blanket, listening to the clamor of the rookery outside. The shouts, the laughter, the quarrels, and the distant strains of a fiddle from a nearby gin shop. Their lives are precarious, but they persist. Reformers like Henry Mayhew and Charles Booth would later document such families, recording the wages they earned, the rent they paid, and the struggles they endured. Their surveys shocked polite society, for many Victorians had little notion of the scale of poverty in their midst. The rookery was not a rare blight, but an entire world within the city, housing tens of thousands. To acknowledge it was to confront the uncomfortable truth that the wealth of London stood atop a foundation of suffering. At night, the rookery takes on a different character. The alleys grow darker, the air colder, and shadows stretch long. Prostitutes wait at corners, their faces half hidden in shawls. Gangs of youths roam, quick to prey on the unwary. A constable's lantern may sweep past, but even he is cautious, for his authority holds little sway in the twisting lanes. Behind shuttered windows, families whisper or pray, hoping the night passes without incident. And then, as dawn approaches, the rookery stirs once more. Men rise to seek work at the docks or labor yards. Women light fires, if they have fuel, to boil thin porridge or brew tea. Children yawn and stretch, ready to scavenge the streets for whatever small fortune might come their way. The fog lifts slowly, but the grime, the struggle, and the stubborn spark of life remain. The rookery, for all its hardship, is not only a place of despair. It is also a crucible of resilience, where families cling to one another, where neighbors share what little they have, and where life, though brutal, persists day after day. To stand in these alleys is to witness the very heart of Victorian London, not the polished face of empire, but the raw, beating pulse of survival. Among the most haunting sights in Victorian London were the children who lived not just in the rookeries, but upon the streets themselves. These young souls, thin as reeds and quick as sparrows, were known by many names depending on how they sought to survive. Some were crossing sweepers, some match sellers, and some, the most daring, were mudlarks and toshers, those who scavenged in the filth of river and sewer alike. To imagine such a child, let us think of Jack, 12 years old. Spendly and sharp-eyed, with hands already calloused from years of work. By dawn, when the mist still clings to the Thames, Jack is at the river's edge. The tide has drawn back, revealing a stretch of mud thick with debris washed down from the teeming city above. With bare feet sinking into the muck, Jack begins his work as a mudlark. The riverbank is no gentle playground. The mud clutches greedily at his legs, sucking at each step. Shards of glass, splintered wood, and rusting iron lie half buried, ready to cut or pierce the unwary. Jack's keen eyes scan for treasure. Scraps of rope, nails, bits of coal spilled from barges. On rare days, he might find a coin, its gleam dulled but still precious. Each discovery means another meal. Another night's rent for a corner in the family's crowded lodging. The life of a mudlark is dangerous. The Thames is fickle, its tides rising without mercy. More than one child has been trapped as the water rushes back in, their cries drowned by the current. The river carries disease as well as debris. Its waters are thick with sewage, chemical runoff, and the waste of thousands of households. Yet for Jack and others like him, the risk is worth it. Better to scavenge in filth than to starve. When the river yields little, Jack sometimes turns tosher, one of those hardy souls who hunt for salvage in the sewers. The sewers of Victorian London are dark, treacherous places, their tunnels lit only by flickering lamps, or the pale daylight that filters through iron grates above. The air is foul beyond imagining, heavy with ammonia and rot. Rats scurry along the edges, their red eyes glinting in the gloom. To work here, Jack carries a long pole with a hook, useful for prodding the muck or pulling free a tangled object. He listens always for the low roar that warns of incoming tide. A tosher caught unawares may be swept away in an instant, his body lost forever in the labyrinth of tunnels. Still, there are rewards. Silver spoons dropped from drains, rags and bones to sell, even the occasional tool or trinket. Each find is a small miracle in a life where miracles are scarce. It is sobering to remember that children like Jack number in the thousands. Orphaned, abandoned, or simply born into families too poor to feed them. They turn to the streets for survival. Some sleep under bridges, some in doorways, some in the casual wards of workhouses, if they can endure the harsh rules. Hunger is their constant companion, driving them to scavenge, steal, or beg. Shoes are rare luxuries, coats are patched until they are more whole than fabric. Their faces are gaunt, their eyes too old for their years. And yet, amid the struggle, there is a strange resilience. Mudlarks and toshers form loose communities, helping one another with warnings or sharing scraps of food. Games erupt between tasks, pebbles skipped across water, or races along the embankment. Children laugh even here, their joy all the more striking against the backdrop of hardship. To watch them is to be reminded of the human spirit's stubborn refusal to yield, even in the harshest of circumstances. Social commentators of the age took note. Writers like Henry Mayhew interviewed mudlarks, recording their words with a mixture of fascination and sorrow. Their reports shocked middle-class readers, who had never imagined children working waist deep in sewage or combing through the detritus of the river for scraps. Charitable societies sprang up to offer aid, founding ragged schools where children could learn to read and write between hours of labor. Some were rescued, given apprenticeships or sent to the countryside. Many more, however, slipped through the cracks, their names and stories lost to time. For Jack, each day ends as it begins, with the city looming over him, vast and indifferent. He returns home with his findings, small though they are, and sets them proudly before his mother. Tonight, there may be enough coal for a fire, enough coins for bread. Tomorrow he will rise again at dawn and face the river, the sewers, or the streets, with hope that fortune might smile, if only a little. The image of such children haunted Victorian society. They were at once a symbol of neglect and of endurance, of a city's failure to protect its young, and of those young ones' astonishing will to live. Their small figures, bent in labor along the Thames, remain one of the most poignant portraits of London in the 19th century. As we step away from the riverbank and out of the sewer tunnels, we carry with us the memory of Jack and countless others like him. Their world was one of mud and shadows, danger and hunger. But it was also one of survival, resilience, and an unquenchable spark of life in the face of overwhelming hardship. To know Victorian London is to know them, for they are woven into the very fabric of its story. For those who could not endure the streets or find shelter in the crowded rookeries, another option loomed in Victorian London: the workhouse. It promised a roof, a bed, and a meal, but at a heavy price: freedom, dignity, and often the very bonds of family. To the poor, it was a place of last resort, both feared and despised. Yet sometimes the only barrier between life and death. The workhouse system had been established under the Poor Law Amendment of 1834. Its architects believed that aid should be given only under harsh conditions, to discourage idleness and reliance on charity. Thus the workhouse was designed not as a haven, but as a deterrent. Its very walls proclaimed severity: high, blank facades of grey stone, barred windows, and heavy doors that creaked shut behind the desperate souls who crossed their thresholds. Step inside, and the air shifts to a chill of discipline. The first act upon admission is separation. Husbands are divided from wives, parents from children, the elderly from the young. The family unit, already fragile under the strain of poverty, is torn apart at the workhouse gate. Belongings are confiscated. What little a pauper owns folded into storage or discarded. Clothing is replaced with rough uniforms of drab cloth, one outfit indistinguishable from the next. In this way, individuality is stripped away, replaced by anonymity and submission. Daily life in the workhouse is a rigid routine. At dawn, the bell rings, and inmates rise from their narrow pallets. The bedding is coarse, the rooms overcrowded, the air stale with the mingled scents of damp straw and unwashed bodies. Breakfast is thin gruel, ladled into bowls chipped from long use. Meals are monotonous and meager: bread, broth, potatoes. Just enough to sustain, never enough to satisfy. Work fills the hours between meals. For the able-bodied, labor is relentless and often meaningless. Men break stones for roadbeds, pound oakum by unraveling ropes into fibers, or shovel earth from one place to another and back again. Women scrub laundry, stitch coarse garments, or tend to the kitchens under strict supervision. Children are set to tasks suited to their size: picking apart threads, carding wool, or sweeping floors. The elderly and infirm, unable to contribute much, languish in cold wards, their ailments tended to only sparingly. Discipline is severe. Rules govern every movement: when to speak, when to eat, when to rise, and when to sleep. Silence is demanded in halls and dormitories. Infractions, however minor, may result in punishment: reduced rations, confinement in isolation cells, or the humiliation of public reprimand. The overseers enforce order with an unyielding hand, for they believe leniency breeds dependence. And yet, despite its cruelties, the workhouse remains crowded. To many, it is still preferable to the bitter cold of the streets. At least within its walls, there is shelter from the rain, and at least the stomach, however empty it feels, receives something. For children orphaned or abandoned, it offers a form of survival, though one marked by discipline rather than comfort. For the old, it is a place to end their days, surrounded not by family, but by strangers equally destitute. Consider Annie Chapman, whose story would one day become infamous when she fell victim to Jack the Ripper. As a child, Annie knew the workhouse well. Her family, struggling through hardship, sought its aid more than once. The experience left scars deeper than hunger. Years later, when she walked the streets of Whitechapel, it was with the memory of those grim stone walls, the thin gruel, the echo of footsteps in endless corridors. The workhouse did not break her spirit entirely, but it shaped the harsh reality she could never escape. Reports from social investigators shed further light on these institutions. Visitors described long rows of wooden beds, their blankets coarse and inadequate. They noted the pallor of inmates, the hollowness in their cheeks, the thinness of their limbs. They remarked upon the eerie quiet, broken only by the clatter of spoons at mealtimes or the dull rhythm of labor. It was not the noise of life that filled these spaces, but the weight of despair. Still, even within the workhouse, humanity flickered. A mother might find ways to send a glance or a smile across the yard to her child. A group of boys, set to unravel ropes, might whisper stories when the overseer's back was turned. Elderly men might trade memories of younger days, clinging to fragments of dignity. Life, however subdued, found its way through the cracks of stone and rule. Outside, the workhouse was a symbol. To some Victorians, it stood as proof of the moral failings of the poor, evidence that discipline was necessary to reform them. To others, it was a shameful indictment of society, a sign that wealth and progress had left too many behind. Charles Dickens, ever the critic of injustice, painted its image vividly in his novels, ensuring that readers could not ignore the plight of those who suffered within its walls. As night falls, the inmates return to their dormitories. The day's labor is done, but rest is hardly refreshing. Beds are narrow, bodies pressed close, the air thick with coughs and snores. Shadows stretch across the stone walls, lit only by the faint glow of lamps in the corridors. Sleep comes, not with peace, but with exhaustion, as the bell promises another day of the same. The workhouse, in all its severity, remains etched into the story of Victorian London. It was a place of survival, of punishment, of sorrow, and, in rare moments, of resilience. For those who entered its gates, life was narrowed to routine and endurance. And for us, looking back, it stands as a reminder of the harsh bargains that poverty demanded, where the cost of shelter was the very freedom of the soul. In the maze of streets that formed London's East End, women bore the heaviest burdens. Poverty pressed upon them from every side, leaving few choices and fewer mercies. To be a woman in Whitechapel during the Victorian age was to live at the intersection of hardship and danger, where survival demanded resilience, ingenuity, and, too often, desperate compromise. The East End was a place of ceaseless labor, yet wages for women were painfully low. A seamstress might toil from dawn until dusk, stitching garments by flickering lamplight, only to earn enough for a crust of bread. Laundresses bent their backs over steaming tubs, their hands raw from lye and soap. Charwomen scrubbed floors, polished grates, and hauled water for wealthier households, their pay meager and their hours long. These jobs, though grueling, were considered respectable, and women clung to them as long as they could. But work was not steady, and illness or the loss of an employer could swiftly plunge a family into destitution. For many, the choice became starker. When pennies could not be stretched, when rent collectors knocked at the door, when children's stomachs growled with hunger, women turned to the streets. Prostitution in Whitechapel was less an occupation than a last refuge, the final thread in the tapestry of survival. Estimates suggest that by the late 19th century, tens of thousands of women in London relied on it, at least part-time. They walked the alleys and courts, shawls pulled tight against the cold, offering themselves for the price of a night's lodging or a hot meal. It was a dangerous life. Clients could be violent, the police unsympathetic, and society harsh in its judgment. Respectable London preferred not to see these women, except in the scandalous columns of newspapers. Yet for the women themselves, it was often a matter of choosing between hunger and risk. The gin shops, with their cheap drink and dim lights, offered fleeting escape. But gin dulled more than hunger. It clouded judgment, weakened the body, and led many deeper into misery. Among these women was Annie Chapman, whose name would one day be etched into history as one of Jack the Ripper's victims. Before that terrible end, Annie was a wife and mother, struggling to hold her family together. When her marriage collapsed and work grew scarce, she drifted into Whitechapel. living in lodging houses and selling flowers or matches by day. By night, she sometimes turned to prostitution. Hers was not an unusual story. It was the story of countless women whose lives balanced on a knife's edge. Another was Mary Nichols, known as Polly, who also met her death at the hands of the Ripper. She had been a domestic servant and later a wife, but poverty pushed her into the same cycle of lodging houses, street work, and gin. Each woman carried with her a past of better days, fragments of dignity and memory. Even as the present forced them into choices no one would willingly embrace. To walk through Whitechapel at night was to encounter these women on nearly every corner. Their voices, sometimes bold, sometimes wary, drifted through the fog. Offers whispered to passers-by, laughter shared with companions, arguments sparked by drunkenness or jealousy. They were part of the city's nocturnal rhythm, their presence as constant as the clatter of carriage wheels or the toll of midnight bells. Social reformers looked upon them with both pity and alarm. Some founded refuges where women could find shelter and work, though places were limited. Others railed against vice, urging stricter policing and harsher punishments. Yet the root of the problem, poverty, remained unaddressed. So long as work was scarce and wages insufficient, so long as the workhouse loomed as a dreaded alternative, women would continue to walk the streets. Children, too, bore witness. Many grew up watching their mothers vanish into the night, returning with coins to buy bread. Some followed in their footsteps, repeating the cycle of desperation. For them, Whitechapel was not a place of choice, but a place of inheritance, where hardship passed from one generation to the next, and, yet, amid despair, moments of humanity shone through. Women formed bonds of friendship and protection. They shared information about dangerous clients, watched one another's backs, and offered comfort in times of loss. In lodging houses, they pooled their coins for shared meals, laughed over stories, or sang songs to lift their spirits. These small acts of solidarity became lifelines in a world where the wider society had turned away. The press, when it did notice them, often painted these women as symbols of moral decay. But to know their stories is to see something more complex. They were mothers, daughters, wives, ordinary women whose lives were bent by poverty and circumstance. Their choices, harsh as they were, reflected the brutal realities of the East End, not a lack of virtue. As we imagine them now, walking through the gaslit streets of Whitechapel, we do not judge. Instead, we see the strength it took simply to survive, the courage to endure each night, and the quiet dignity they clung to in spite of scorn. Their footsteps echo softly in the fog, a reminder that behind every shadowed figure was a life, a story, a heart still beating against the odds. In the chapters ahead, darker tales await, of crime, of violence, of fear stalking these very streets. But before those shadows fall, we pause here with the women of Whitechapel, acknowledging their struggle, their resilience, and the truth that their lives were not defined solely by despair, but by the simple, unyielding act of carrying on. At the heart of London's might and misery alike lay the docks. Stretching along the banks of the River Thames, they were the pulsing veins of an empire that spanned continents. Ships arrived daily, heavy with cargo from distant lands. Tea from India, spices from Ceylon, silks from China, and timber from Canada. The air was alive with the sounds of maritime life, the groan of rigging, the thud of crates, the whistle of foremen driving laborers to their tasks. To stand at the edge of the docks was to glimpse the vast reach of Britain's dominion. Vessels flying many flags clustered together, their sails furled, their holds filled with exotic goods. Dockside warehouses, tall and grimy, loomed over the bustling quays, ready to swallow the treasures of the empire and release them into London's endless appetite. But for the men who worked here, the docks were less a marvel than a grindstone. The dockers were the backbone of this world, men of muscle and endurance. their bodies honed by ceaseless lifting and carrying. They hefted crates of tea, rolled barrels of rum, dragged bales of cotton, and shouldered sacks of grain. Their labor was backbreaking, and accidents were common. A slip of footing, a snapped rope, or a falling crate could maim or kill in an instant. Safety regulations were few, and the men knew that any injury might cast them aside, unfit for work, with no compensation to sustain their families. Yet the greatest hardship was not only the danger but the uncertainty. Dock work was casual labor, granted on a daily basis. Each morning, crowds of men gathered at the dock gates, waiting anxiously for a foreman to choose who would be hired. The process was ruthless and humiliating, with desperate men jostling, pleading, and sometimes bribing for a chance at a day's wage. Those chosen might work 12 hours or more for little pay. Those turned away returned home empty-handed, their families left hungry. The system bred resentment and despair, yet it endured for decades. Some men found a bitter comfort in the camaraderie of shared suffering, bonding over pence in the dockside pubs. There, amid the tang of salt air and the smoke of cheap tobacco, they told stories of near misses, cursed the foreman, and dreamed of steadier work. The pubs themselves, though often rowdy, became an extension of the docks, a place where men could rest their weary arms and momentarily forget the grind. For boys of the East End, the docks held a curious allure. The sight of towering ships and foreign sailors hinted at adventure beyond the grey streets. Some became errand boys or messengers, darting between warehouses and taverns. A few, too restless for the drudgery of land, managed to sign on as cabin boys, trading the hardship of Whitechapel for the dangers of the sea. Yet most remained tethered to the city, their lives circumscribed by poverty's narrow bounds. Women also found work at the docks, though seldom in the visible bustle of unloading ships. They cleaned, cooked, or stitched sailcloth in nearby workshops. Some sold food from makeshift stalls, offering bread, pies, or mugs of steaming tea to weary dockers. Others drifted through the taverns, plying trades more precarious. Their presence, though less noticed, was part of the daily rhythm, and their earnings, however small, often sustained entire households. The docks were not only about labor, they were also about spectacle. Londoners from wealthier districts sometimes visited the wharves to marvel at the exotic cargo and the colorful crews. Sailors from Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean mingled with local dockers, their languages and dress adding flashes of difference to the otherwise grimy landscape. Yet such encounters were often tinged with suspicion and prejudice. Victorian society was fascinated by the foreign, but quick to push outsiders to the margins. For all its hardship, the docks symbolized possibility. Goods that passed through here fed industries, clothed millions, and enriched merchants. Each crate of tea sold in a West End shop, each bolt of cloth unfurled in a tailor's hands, was a reminder of the toil that began on the quays. The wealth of the empire glittered in drawing rooms and department stores, but its foundation was laid by calloused hands in the damp fog of the docks. The atmosphere here was distinct from Whitechapel's cramped alleys, though the two were connected by poverty. At the docks, the air smelled of tar, fish, and coal smoke. Seagulls circled overhead, crying shrilly as they scavenged scraps. The shouts of men echoed off the water, mingling with the clanging of chains and the slosh of the river against stone. At night, lanterns glimmered along the piers, casting shifting reflections that danced across the inky surface of the Thames. Life near the docks was precarious, yet not without pride. For many men, the identity of a docker was a badge of endurance. They bore the weight of empire, quite literally, on their backs. Families spoke of fathers and grandfathers who had worked the same piers, their strength etched into the very timbers of the wharves. But beneath that pride simmered resentment. Strikes and protests sometimes flared, as dockers demanded fairer wages and more secure employment. The most famous of these, The Great Dock Strike of 1889 would unite thousands of workers and capture the city's attention. But even before that moment, the seeds of discontent were sown daily in the casual cruelty of the hiring system. To stroll along the docks in the late Victorian years was to witness both empire and exploitation. The ships spoke of power, commerce, and adventure, while the bent backs of the dockers told of struggle, risk, and endurance. The Thames flowed past it all, indifferent, carrying barges and detritus alike toward the sea. And so, as the fog drifts in once more, softening the outlines of masts and warehouses, we leave the docks behind. They remain, in memory, as both a marvel and a misery, a place where London's wealth was made possible, and where countless lives were spent in toil for little reward. If the docks were London's gateway to the empire, then the factories and sweatshops were its relentless heart. From dawn until well past dusk, their chimneys belched black smoke into the sky, staining the clouds and settling like soot on the narrow streets. The thrum of machinery echoed across the city, an unceasing chorus of clattering looms, pounding hammers, and rattling presses. To live near a factory was to live, with its Norways in the background, a constant reminder of the machine's demands. Factories rose in every district, large and small. Some were vast, brick-built complexes, their windows glowing orange at night, lit by flickering gas lamps. Others were cramped workshops tucked into alleyways, where dozens of laborers bent over benches in rooms barely large enough to move. Whether grand or hidden, each place shared the same hunger for labor. Men, women, and children filled these spaces, trading their hours and their health for meager pay. Inside, the air was heavy and close. Dust floated in thick clouds from mills, where cotton and wool were spun into thread. In match factories, the acrid sting of phosphorus clung to the workers' lungs, eating slowly at their bones. In workshops where garments were stitched, oil lamps smoked and gutters leaked, leaving damp patches that never quite dried. In every case, ventilation was poor, and the rooms often sweltered in summer or froze in winter. Comfort was a luxury none expected. The hours were punishing. 12-hour days were common, 6 days a week, sometimes more. Workers arrived before the first light of dawn, trudging through fog and frost to take their places at the machines. Children, often no more than 8 or 9 years old, worked alongside their parents. Their nimble fingers were prized for knotting threads, picking debris from looms, or piecing together small components. Yet those same small fingers were often caught in gears or crushed beneath press plates. Injuries were frequent, and compensation was rare. The rhythm of factory life was dictated not by the sun, but by the machine. A bell or whistle marked the start of work, the pause for meals, and the final release. Meals themselves were hurried affairs, often eaten on the floor or at workbenches. Bread, cheese, and sometimes a mug of tea were enough to keep the body moving, if not nourished. Fatigue settled into every bone, but still the machines demanded more. It was not only the physical toll that weighed upon the workers, but the monotony. A man might spend his life turning the same screw, pulling the same lever, or watching the same loom. Women bent their backs over endless seams, their eyes straining in dim light, until headaches became constant companions. Children, too young to complain, accepted the drudgery as the only world they knew. Dreams of other lives flickered briefly, but were quickly extinguished beneath the routine of necessity. Among the most infamous of these workplaces was the Bryant and May Match Factory. Here, women and girls known as the Matchstick Girls worked 14-hour days with little pause. The white phosphorus used in match production poisoned their bodies, rotting jaws and leaving terrible wounds, a disease grimly nicknamed phossy jaw. When reformer Annie Besant exposed these conditions in 1888, the public was horrified, and the match girls' strike that followed became a symbol of resistance. Yet Bryant and May was only one example among many. Countless factories operated unseen, their abuses hidden behind brick walls and iron gates. Sweatshops, smaller but no less grueling, were scattered across the East End. Garment makers, often entire families, stitched by candlelight in rooms so crowded that elbows brushed constantly. Finished clothing was sold cheaply in markets, or shipped off to wealthier districts, where ladies and gentlemen admired the fashions with no thought for the hands that made them. Payment in these sweatshops was often by the piece, forcing workers to produce at a frantic pace just to earn enough for bread. Despite the harshness, there was resilience among the workers. They sang to keep spirits alive, shared scraps of food, and told stories during the brief pauses allowed. In some factories, friendships blossomed, offering small comforts in otherwise bleak surroundings. In others, whispers of unions and strikes stirred, a dangerous hope that one day conditions might improve. The late Victorian period saw the beginnings of organized labor among the working poor, though victories were slow and hard-won. Outside the factory gates, life continued much the same. Workers returned home to crowded lodgings, carrying with them the grime of the day. Their clothes reeked of smoke or chemicals, their hands raw and calloused. Families shared meager suppers, children collapsed into sleep, and parents prepared for another day of toil. For many, the cycle seemed endless, stretching on with no promise of relief. Yet even within this cycle, there were glimmers of pride. A man might point to a bolt of cloth and say he had woven it, or a woman to a shirt and say she had sewn it. Their contributions, though rarely acknowledged, were woven into the fabric of London itself. The garments, matches, tools, and goods produced in these factories flowed outward, shaping not only the city, but the empire beyond. As we linger in these factories and sweatshops, we sense the duality of Victorian industry, its marvels and its miseries. The same machines that clothed the masses and filled the shops also consumed the bodies and lives of the poor. The same progress that lit drawing rooms left scars on the hands that made it possible. London's wealth, once again, was built upon labor invisible to those who benefited most. The bell sounds once more, marking the end of another endless shift. Workers file out into the fog, shoulders bowed, eyes wary, but steps steady. Tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, the machines will call again, and the people of London will answer. Amid the smoke and grind of Victorian industry, there were moments when the oppressed raised their heads and found their voices. One of the most remarkable came in the summer of 1888, when a group of young women from East London, the match girls of Bryant and May, challenged one of the city's most powerful companies. Their strike, small in scale compared to the empire's vast industries, would nonetheless become a beacon of courage and solidarity, remembered long after the last match was struck. The Bryant and May match factory stood in Bow, a district already thick with hardship. Hundreds of women and girls, some no more than 12 years old, filed through its gates each morning. Inside, they worked 14-hour days in air clouded with white phosphorus dust. The chemical was cheap and effective, but deadly. It ate away at bones, causing a grotesque condition known as phocy jaw, where the jaw rotted slowly, leaving victims in pain and disfigurement. Wages were meager, deductions frequent, and punishments swift. The match girls were not meek victims, though society often imagined them so. They were spirited, quick-witted, and fiercely loyal to one another. Their chatter and laughter echoed in the workshops, even as their hands moved endlessly, dipping, drying, and boxing matches. Yet beneath the banter lay simmering resentment. The foreman wielded power carelessly, docking pay for trivial reasons, fining girls for dropping matches, or penalizing them for arriving even a few minutes late. The work was dangerous and the wages unjust, but most endured because alternatives were scarce. The spark of rebellion came not from within the factory at first, but from without. In June of 1888, social reformer Annie Besant published an article exposing the matchgirls' conditions. She described their low pay, the toxic dangers of phosphorus, and the petty tyranny of management. The article stirred public outrage, but it also carried risk. Bryant and May, anxious to protect their reputation, tried to force the women to sign statements denying the claims. Instead of submitting, the match girls resisted. On July 5, 1888, about 400 workers walked out of the factory. It was a stunning act of defiance. These were young women, most desperately poor, standing against one of the most prominent companies in London. Newspapers seized on the story, some mocking the factory girls, but many admiring their bravery. Crowds gathered in support, and sympathy for the match girls spread rapidly across the city. The strike was not only about wages and conditions, it was about dignity. The match girls refused to be silenced or shamed. They organized meetings, marched together, and petitioned Parliament. Their courage electrified reformers, trade unionists, and ordinary Londoners alike. For the first time, many people saw that even the poorest workers, even young women with little education or influence, could stand together and demand change. Annie Besant herself was astonished by the match girls' determination. She had given them a voice in print, but they took up that voice and made it their own. The strike committee, composed of the workers themselves, negotiated with management and spoke to the press. Their speeches were fiery, their demands clear: better pay, safer conditions, and an end to unfair fines. Public pressure mounted. Bryant and May could not withstand the wave of sympathy for the strikers. After little more than 2 weeks, the company agreed to improve conditions, abolish unjust fines, and allow the formation of a union. Though the strike did not eliminate the use of white phosphorus, that battle would come later. It marked a profound victory. For the match girls, it was proof that unity could bring even the mighty to their knees. The strike's significance went beyond the factory walls. It inspired broader movements for workers' rights, particularly among women and unskilled laborers. It showed that those often dismissed as powerless could, in fact, alter the course of history. The Match Girls Union became a model for others, and their example resonated far beyond London. In the East End itself, the triumph lifted spirits. For a time, the Match Girls were local heroines, symbols of pride in a community too often associated with misery. Their story traveled through lodging houses, pubs, and marketplaces, offering hope that the grind of daily life could be challenged, however briefly. Still, the victory was not a fairy tale. Many of the match girls returned to the same exhausting work, still exposed to phosphorus fumes, still struggling to make ends meet. Poverty remained a constant shadow, yet the memory of their strike lingered, a reminder that solidarity was possible. And that even in the darkest corners of Victorian London, sparks of resistance could glow. To picture the strike today is to imagine the streets of Bow, filled with young women in worn dresses, marching shoulder to shoulder through the fog. Their voices rise above the din of carriages and factory bells, carrying demands that cannot be ignored. They are tired, hungry, and poor, but their steps are steady, their resolve unshaken. The match girls of 1888 did not just fight for themselves. They lit a flame that would burn in the hearts of workers for generations. Their story, told in whispers and shouts, remains part of the living fabric of London. A reminder that even in times of hardship, courage can strike like a match, illuminating the darkness, however briefly. When life pressed too heavily, when hunger gnawed and exhaustion hollowed the spirit, many of London's poor sought refuge in oblivion. In the East End especially, where tenements sagged and alleys reeked of filth, escapes could be found in smoke-filled rooms and glittering taverns. Opium and gin, two intoxicating comforts, were the solace of the weary, the desperate, and the forgotten. The opium dens of Victorian London were shadowed places, tucked behind unmarked doors in Whitechapel and Limehouse. Inside, the air hung thick with the sweet, sickly scent of burning poppy resin. Thin mattresses lined the floors, their covers stained and tattered. Men and women sprawled in languid heaps, pipes clutched loosely in their fingers, eyes half closed as the world outside dissolved into dream. The glow of dim lanterns cast everything in a hazy amber light, softening the filth and disguising the despair. Here, time seemed to vanish. Hours slipped by unnoticed as smoke coiled upward in slow spirals. For a few pennies, a man might forget the chill of hunger or the ache in his bones. For a few hours, a woman might drift free of grief or fear. Some came nightly, others only when life became unbearable, but all sought the same temporary mercy escape. Opium was not new to London, but in the Victorian era its presence swelled. The empire's grip on India and China ensured that the trade flowed steadily. Ships unloaded chests of raw opium and manufactured laudanum, the latter a tincture of opium and alcohol sold openly in chemist shops. Laudanum bottles sat on household shelves beside vinegar and soap, taken for sleeplessness, for coughs, for woman's troubles. It was both medicine and menace, woven so seamlessly into daily life that many did not recognize the line between remedy and addiction until it was too late. In the East End dens, however, there was no mistaking its hold. Writers like Charles Dickens and later Arthur Conan Doyle painted lurid pictures of these places, half fact, half imagined. But the truth needed little embellishment. Visitors described rooms filled with ghostly figures, shadows of people rather than people themselves. Some lay silent, lost to visions, others muttered or wept softly, caught in dreams they could not control. Yet opium was only one form of escape. The other, cheaper and far more widespread, was gin, known bitterly in the 18th century as mother's ruin. Gin had by the 19th century regained its place as the drink of the poor. Gin shops and palaces dotted the East End, their doors glowing invitingly in the fog. A gin palace was a sight to behold: glass, chandeliers glittering, mirrors reflecting endless light, counters polished bright with brass fittings. Sawdust crunched underfoot, soaking up the spills of countless mugs. Behind the bar, casks and bottles gleamed like treasure. For the price of a penny, a man or woman could buy a small measure of gin, strong enough to blur the sharp edges of reality. Inside, the mood swung wildly between raucous cheer and sorrowful collapse. Songs rose, slurred and merry, until quarrels broke out and fists flew. Laughter rang out from one corner, while in another someone sobbed quietly into their glass. It was a place of contradictions, where companionship mingled with loneliness, where joy teetered constantly on the brink of despair. Women drank as much as men, sometimes more. For many, gin dulled the sting of hunger or warmed the body against the bitter cold. Mothers gave it to their children to help them sleep, an act born not of cruelty, but of desperation. The cheap spirit flowed freely, and with it flowed the troubles of the East End. The authorities worried over gin shops, just as they did over opium dens. Reformers denounced them as dens of vice, breeding grounds of crime and immorality. Police kept a wary eye on them, though enforcement was uneven. Respectable society clucked its tongue at the sight of staggering drunks, but few paused to consider why so many sought refuge in a bottle. Poverty, after all, was not so easily escaped. For the drinkers and smokers themselves, morality was far away. What mattered was the momentary easing of pain, the borrowed warmth, the illusion of freedom. In a life where workhouses loomed and starvation lurked, such illusions were precious. Gin and opium could not mend broken bones or fill empty stomachs, but they could soften the sharpness of life, if only for a while. Yet the price was heavy. Addiction crept quietly, claiming men who once vowed only to drink on payday, women who swore they needed laudanum only for headaches. Families spent what little they had on spirits instead of bread, and children grew hungry. Violence flared in drunken fits. Illness spread among those whose bodies grew frail under the strain of toxins. The escapes that offered relief often deepened despair. Still, these dens and palaces thrived, They became part of London's rhythm, woven into the very fabric of the city. To walk through Whitechapel at night was to pass by glowing taverns, hear the laughter spilling out, and catch the faint notes of a song. To step inside was to enter another world, one where misery was forgotten, if only for a fleeting moment. And so, amid the choking fog and the ceaseless grind of work, the poor of London sought their escapes. Some dreamed in opium's haze. Others drowned sorrow in gin's fiery embrace. Both left marks upon the city and upon those who indulged. Both revealed the yearning of human beings for relief, however fleeting, from lives that asked too much and offered too little. As we leave the smoky dens and glittering palaces, we carry with us not judgment, but understanding. These were not places of simple vice, but of refuge. They were mirrors reflecting the hardships of Victorian London, and the endless search for something, anything, that might make life bearable, if only until morning. Few images of Victorian London are as enduring as its fog. Writers described it with dread and fascination. Artists painted it in ghostly swirls. To the people who lived beneath it, though, the fog was not a quaint backdrop. It was a suffocating, choking presence, an ever-returning shroud that could blot out the world. The fog was not the natural mist of damp mornings. It was man-made, born of countless chimneys that belched smoke from coal fires. In every home, hearths burned to heat rooms and cook meals. In every factory, furnaces roared. The smoke rose thick into the air, mixing with the natural moisture of the Thames Valley. The result was the infamous London particular, better known by those who endured it as the pea soup fog. It was called that for its color: yellow, green, sometimes brown, dense as broth and acrid in the lungs. On heavy days the fog rolled in like a tide, swallowing streets and buildings whole. Lamps burned at noon, their light struggling to pierce the gloom. Carriages crept forward with drivers calling warnings into the murk. Pedestrians held handkerchiefs to their mouths, groping their way by touch along familiar walls. Inside the fog, sound was muffled, distorted. Footsteps loomed suddenly close, then faded into nothing. A shout carried oddly, as though disembodied. The world shrank to a few paces in any direction. Some likened the experience to wandering through a dream, others to stumbling blind through a nightmare. For the poor of the East End, the fog brought more than inconvenience. It deepened their daily struggles. Work slowed, or stopped entirely, when factories could not function, leaving laborers without wages. Market stalls stood empty, when goods could not be delivered through the murk. The already precarious lives of the poor grew even more uncertain when the fog descended. The health effects were even worse. Coal smoke was heavy with soot and sulfur. When trapped in the fog, these particles became poison. The air stung the eyes and burned the throat. Breathing grew painful, especially for the very young and the very old. Hospitals filled with patients suffering from fog fever, a blend of bronchitis, pneumonia, and asthma. Death rates spiked during foggy weeks, though few officials dared admit how deadly the air had become. Crime, too, found cover in the fog. Thieves took advantage of the blindness it imposed, slipping unseen through alleys or vanishing after a robbery. Police struggled to patrol when even the glow of their lanterns barely reached their own feet. Stories spread of murders committed in the pea soup murk, where victims saw nothing and suspects vanished into the vapor. Whether or not all the tales were true, the fear was real. Not all despised the fog, however. Some artists and poets saw beauty in its strangeness. Painters captured the way light fractured through the haze, softening outlines and turning the city into a blur of gold and shadow. Writers wove it into tales of mystery, where the fog itself seemed a character, silent, watchful, and ever present. Charles Dickens, Arthur Conan Doyle, and countless others etched its ghostly image into the literature of the age. Yet beauty was small comfort to those who had to live with it. Imagine a mother clutching her child's hand as they inch homeward, the child coughing into the crook of their arm. Picture a dockworker stranded in the gloom, unable to find his way back to his lodging, pockets empty from a lost day's pay. For them, the fog was not art, it was misery. The fog was worst in winter, when cold air trapped smoke low to the ground. December days could pass in near darkness, with the sun little more than a pale glow behind a yellow curtain. Shops lit lamps all day, their windows glowing faintly like beacons in the murk. Inside cramped rooms, families huddled close to their own smoky fires, knowing their comfort only added to the problem. It was a vicious circle. Coal kept them warm, but coal also poisoned the air they breathed. Visitors often marveled at the sight, but residents endured it with weary resignation. Londoners learned to live by the fog's rhythms, to prepare for days when the city would simply vanish. They carried lanterns, memorized every turn of their streets, and listened carefully for the creak of wheels or the clop of hooves to avoid collision. Even so, accidents were common. Horses stumbled into unseen ditches, carriages collided, and pedestrians lost their way, sometimes fatally. The fog was not unique to London, but nowhere else did it reach such intensity or fame. It became part of the city's identity, as inseparable as the Thames or the toll of Big Ben. To outsiders, it symbolized mystery. To those within, it symbolized hardship. And while reformers and scientists debated solutions, the poor continued to choke on the very air they breathed. When at last the fog lifted, as it always did, the city seemed reborn. Streets reappeared, roofs took shape against the sky, and the sun poured through like a blessing. Yet relief was always temporary. Everyone knew it would return, sometimes tomorrow, sometimes next week, rolling in again with the slow certainty of the tide. The pea soup fog was more than weather. It was a reminder of the cost of progress, of an empire built on coal and industry. It was the breath of a city that had grown too vast, too hungry, to care for the lungs of its people. For those who lived in its grasp, the fog was not simply an inconvenience or a curiosity. It was life, as inescapable as poverty itself. Where there is poverty, there are rats, and in Victorian London, poverty stretched for miles. The city teemed with humanity, but it also teemed with vermin. Creatures that thrived on the scraps, waste, and filth of a capital bursting at the seams. In the cramped rookeries and dank alleys of the East End, rats multiplied beyond counting, their sharp claws skittering over cobblestones, and their bright eyes glinting in the lamplight. The rat was more than a nuisance. It was a companion to misery, spreading fear as it spread disease. They nested in crumbling tenements, gnawed through floorboards, and darted boldly across rooms, where whole families huddled together. At night, their scratching and squeaking filled the air, a reminder that survival in London meant sharing space with vermin. In the darkest corners, children learned to sleep despite the sound of tiny claws racing near their pillows. Out of this infestation grew a curious profession, the rat catcher. These men, and sometimes boys, made a living by waging war on the rodents that plagued the city. They roamed the streets with sacks, cages, and terriers in tow, offering their services to housewives, shopkeepers, and innkeepers desperate for relief. For a small fee, a rat catcher would unleash his dogs into a cellar or storeroom, watching with grim satisfaction as they tore through the scurrying horde. Some rat catchers preferred to use ferrets, sliding the lithe animals into holes where dogs could not reach. Others relied on poisons, though these often posed as much risk to children and pets as to the rats themselves. Whatever the method, the work was dirty and dangerous. A bite from a cornered rat could lead to festering wounds or deadly infection. Yet the demand never ceased. In a city where food supplies were meager and disease rampant, the presence of rats was not merely unpleasant, it was a threat to survival. The rats carried fleas, and the fleas carried sickness. Typhus, cholera, and worse found eager hosts in the teeming streets. Though the dreaded plague of earlier centuries had not returned in full force. Memories of it still haunted the collective imagination. Any whisper of an outbreak sent shivers through the populace, and the sight of a rat skittering across a workhouse floor was enough to stir old fears. Doctors wrote grimly about miasmas and vapors, still uncertain of the true causes of disease, yet they all agreed the vermin worsened London's misery. The rat catcher himself often became a familiar figure, a mixture of fascination and disgust. Children followed him as he paraded through the streets with cages brimming with live captures, rats squealing and clawing at the bars. He might sell the rats later, not as food but for sport. In taverns and gambling dens, rat baiting was a popular, if brutal, pastime. A pit would be filled with a dozen or more rats, and wagers placed on how quickly a terrier could dispatch them. Men cheered and coins exchanged hands, while dogs lunged and rodents squealed. It was entertainment drawn straight from the filth of the city, both celebrated and condemned. For all its cruelty, rat baiting provided the rat catcher with extra income. Rats caught alive brought higher profit than those killed outright. And so the trade endured, a strange balance between extermination and preservation, fueled by the endless tide of vermin that poured from London's sewers and cellars. The rat was not confined to the East End. Even the wealthy could not entirely escape. In grand houses, maids might open a pantry door, only to see a tail vanish into the shadows. But in the glittering homes of Mayfair, infestations were swiftly dealt with, the servants ensuring their masters need not see the problem. It was in the rookeries and tenements, where garbage piled in alleys and raw sewage seeped beneath floorboards, that rats ruled unchallenged. Children sometimes hunted rats themselves, not for money, but for food. Desperation drove them to it, and though the meat was tough and foul, hunger could make almost anything edible. These were the darkest corners of London life, seldom spoken of openly, yet impossible to ignore. Survival left little room for revulsion. Some reformers took note of the problem, arguing that sanitation held the key. If streets were cleared of refuse, if proper drains and sewers were built, the rat population might diminish. But progress was slow, and the rat catchers continued to ply their trade well into the late century. They became part of the city's character, like the chimney sweep or the mudlark, figures born from necessity, laboring in shadows few others dared to enter. Imagine, then, walking the streets of London on a damp evening. The fog hangs low, lanterns glow faintly, and from a side alley comes the sound of barking and squealing. There you find a rat catcher crouched low, his terrier darting after a blur of movement. He waits, sack open, to scoop up the twitching prize. A grim smile crosses his face. Another rat claimed, another coin earned. For him this is routine, a night's work in a city where vermin outnumber men. And yet, for all his efforts, the rats always return. They are survivors, feeding on scraps of bread, on garbage tossed carelessly into the gutter, on the waste of an overcrowded metropolis. In many ways, they are a mirror of the poor themselves, driven into the margins, despised, and yet endlessly resilient. London may scorn them, but it cannot rid itself of them. So the rat catcher walks on, lantern swinging at his side, dogs padding at his heels, sack wrething with his latest catches. His trade is a dirty one, but in Victorian London, dirty trades were often the most necessary. The vermin will always be back, and so too will he. Among the many trades that consumed the lives of London's poor, few were as haunting as the match factories. To the casual observer, matches seemed a trivial object, a slender stick tipped with a small head, ready to spark a flame. But behind these little conveniences lay a world of toil, suffering, and slow decay, endured by the women and girls who became known as the matchstick girls. The most notorious of these factories stood in Bow, East London, operated by the company Bryant and May. Its sprawling rooms were filled with rows of wooden benches, where girls as young as 12 bent their heads to endless tasks. Some split wood into thin slivers, others dipped the slivers into chemicals, while others boxed the finished matches for sale. Each step required speed, precision, and above all endurance. The hours stretched long, 12, sometimes 14 a day, and the pay was meager, barely enough to purchase bread and tea. But the true cruelty of the work came not from the hours, nor even the low wages. It came from the substance that coated the match heads white phosphorus. At first glance, it was a marvel, capable of igniting with the faintest friction. Yet its fumes carried a poison that seeped silently into the body of anyone who breathed them daily. The girls soon learned to recognize the signs. A dull ache in the jaw, at first dismissed as a bad tooth. Then the pain deepened, swelling the face, loosening teeth, until the bone itself began to rot. The condition became known grimly as phossy jaw. Flesh turned black, pus oozed from the gums, and a sickly odor clung to the victim. Surgeons sometimes removed whole sections of jaw in desperate attempts to halt the spread, but many girls wasted away despite the effort. It was a grotesque affliction, slow and merciless. The factory owners denied responsibility. They argued that the disease was rare, that it came only from poor hygiene, that the girls themselves were to blame. Yet the truth was evident to anyone who stepped inside the workrooms. The air was thick with a sharp, acrid smell. The fumes clung to hair and clothes. Workers coughed and wiped streaming eyes, their hands raw from constant handling of the corrosive substance. Every breath they drew was another step toward sickness. Still, the jobs were sought after. For the daughters of the East End, options were few. Domestic service might mean better conditions, but places were scarce and required references many poor families could not provide. Factory work, for all its misery, offered at least the promise of coins at week's end. Mothers sent their daughters through the factory gates knowing the risks, yet unable to choose otherwise. Poverty was a harder master than phosphorus. Yet out of this grim trade came a spark of resistance. In 1888, a woman named Annie Besant, a writer and activist, published a fiery article exposing the plight of the matchstick girls. She described their long hours, pitiful pay, and above all, the horror of phossy jaw. Her words caught the attention of the public, stirring outrage and sympathy. The girls themselves found courage in her support. They organized, an astonishing act for young women dismissed as powerless, and they went on strike. Hundreds of match workers left their benches. Braving the wrath of the factory owners and the threat of starvation, they marched through the streets, pale faces set with determination, carrying their grievance into the heart of London. The strike shocked society. Newspapers covered it eagerly, reformers rallied behind it, and the public began to question the morality of matches that cost young women their health. After weeks of pressure, the company agreed to some concessions, small wage increases, better conditions, and eventually reduced reliance on white phosphorus. Though far from perfect, it was a victory, proof that even the most vulnerable could raise their voices and be heard. Still, for many girls, the change came too late. Their bodies bore the scars of years in poisoned air. Teeth gone, jaws disfigured, lungs scarred. These were wounds that no reform could heal. Some carried the damage quietly into adulthood, hiding their faces beneath shawls, while others succumbed early to illness and pain. The matchstick girls became a symbol. They were proof that progress, so proudly trumpeted in Victorian London, was built on fragile shoulders. Their suffering stood as a reminder that industrial triumphs carried hidden costs, paid in the lives of the poor. The light of every match was born from darkness, sparked by the toil of those who could never afford to bask in its glow. Imagine, if you will, one of these girls at her bench. Her fingers move swiftly, dipping slivers of wood into the glowing paste, setting them aside to dry, boxing them by the dozen. Around her, the air shimmers faintly with the fumes. Invisible yet deadly, she coughs, rubs her jaw, tries to ignore the H that has begun to settle there. She is only 14. And she has many hours to go before the overseer releases her into the foggy night. The matches she packs will travel across London, into the pockets of gentlemen, onto the shelves of shopkeepers, into the kitchens of families who will strike them without thought. They will light candles, pipes, and fires, illuminating rooms far removed from the factory floor. Few who hold them will know, or care, of the price paid in teeth, flesh, and bone. And yet, her story, and those of her sisters, would not vanish. Through courage and persistence, they forced London to look at them, not as nameless workers, but as young women with lives, dreams, and rights. Their strike lit a flame brighter than any match, one that flickered through history as a symbol of resilience against impossible odds. If there was one institution that loomed like a shadow over the lives of Victorian London's poor, it was the workhouse. Officially, they were places of relief, meant to provide food and shelter for those who could no longer survive on their own. In practice, they were feared, dreaded, and often described as little more than prisons for the destitute. The idea behind the workhouse was simple: to deter idleness. Lawmakers believed that poverty was not merely misfortune, but often laziness, a moral failing. So, rather than offer charity without condition, they created institutions where the poor could earn their keep through labor. Anyone desperate enough to enter would find food and a roof. Yes, but at a heavy cost. The cost was dignity. Families who applied for relief were almost always separated. Husbands and wives sent to different wards, children divided by age and gender, never permitted to share more than a fleeting glance across the courtyard. The bonds of family, which held people together through hardship, were deliberately broken at the threshold. The daily life inside was rigid and joyless. At dawn, a bell clanged through the halls, rousing the weary. Breakfast followed. A thin porridge ladled into bowls, accompanied by a crust of bread. Afterward, men and women were dispatched to labor. Men might break stones for roadwork, pick oakum from old ropes, or perform other monotonous, back-breaking tasks. Women scrubbed floors, laundered endless bundles of clothes, or sewed until their fingers ached. Children were set to chores suited to their size, carrying water, sweeping, or helping in the kitchens. Silence was often enforced. Overseers patrolled the wards with sharp eyes, ensuring that no one idled or spoke too freely. Even mealtimes were hushed affairs, the scraping of spoons the loudest sound in the echoing halls. Dinner was usually little better than breakfast, perhaps a stew of questionable quality, or bread and cheese. Meat was rare, fresh vegetables rarer still. Hunger lingered, even within walls meant to provide relief. The workhouses smelled of bleach, sweat, and despair. Windows were small and high, designed not for comfort but for containment. Rows of narrow beds lined the dormitories, mattresses thin and blankets scratchy. Privacy was non-existent. At night, the coughing of the sick, the crying of children, and the groans of the weary blended into a restless chorus. For many, the greatest cruelty was the stripping away of self-respect. Upon entry, personal belongings were confiscated. Clothes were exchanged for uniforms, plain and coarse, marking the wearer unmistakably as a pauper. Even names sometimes seemed to matter less than numbers in the record books. A man might enter with pride, but soon found himself reduced to a body filling a bed, a set of hands completing a task. Those who managed the workhouses often defended their severity. They argued that if conditions were too comfortable, people would flock to them unnecessarily. Hardship, they said, was the best deterrent. The workhouse was not meant to be a refuge. It was meant to be the last resort. But for many, it was the only resort. The elderly, who could no longer work, widows with children, abandoned by fortune or by men, the sick, the crippled, the unlucky, all passed through the iron gates. The stigma was crushing. To be known as a workhouse inmate was to be marked with shame. Even among the poor, Those who relied on the workhouse were whispered about with pity or contempt. And yet, within these grim walls, life persisted. Children still played in snatched moments, whispering jokes and games, when overseers' backs were turned. Mothers still comforted their little ones, singing lullabies over the creak of bed springs. Some inmates formed friendships, bound by shared suffering, lending each other scraps of kindness that no overseer could forbid. There were stories, too, of cruelty at its worst. Overseers who abused their authority, doling out punishments for imagined slights. Food withheld, privileges stripped, sick inmates neglected. Death came quietly in the workhouse, and often unremarked, save for a simple entry in the ledger. The pauper's funeral awaited. No family procession, no carved headstone, only a plain box lowered into a communal grave. Yet reformers in London could not ignore the mounting criticisms forever. Investigative writers and campaigners drew attention to the harsh realities. Charles Dickens, in Oliver Twist, immortalized the cruelty of the system with his tale of the boy who dared to ask for more. Though dramatized, his story reflected truths many already knew. The workhouse was not salvation, but humiliation. Gradually, changes came. Inspections were tightened, abuses reduced, conditions improved in some districts. Still, the fundamental design remained the same, to remind the poor that they should dread the workhouse more than the streets. Imagine, if you will, standing before the gate of such a place. The stone walls rise bleak against the sky, the iron bars clanging shut as you step inside. You are weary, hungry, perhaps clutching a child's hand. Relief lies beyond, but at a price you can feel in your bones. You know you may never again share a meal with your family, never again sleep beside your spouse, never again wear your own clothes. The choice is survival, but survival stripped bare of freedom and pride. The workhouse was Victorian London's answer to poverty, and in answering it, the city revealed much about itself. It feared poverty, despised it, and sought to hide it behind walls. Yet within those walls, the poor endured, their spirits bent, but not always broken. The workhouse was both cage and refuge, punishment and salvation, misery and endurance all at once. To walk through the streets of Victorian London was to see children everywhere, darting between carts, clinging to their mothers, shouting wares for sale. But for countless others, childhood itself was a luxury they could not afford. From the earliest years, poor children were thrust into labor, their small hands and nimble bodies seen not as lives to be nurtured, but as tools to be used. The work they did was varied, but it shared one trait: it was hard, dangerous, and poorly paid. Chimney sweeping was among the most infamous. Small boys, some no older than 6, were forced to clamber up soot, choked flues, their knees and elbows scraping raw against brick. Armed with little more than a brush and the strength of their lungs, they wriggled through narrow shafts barely wide enough for their bodies. Many suffocated when stuck, or tumbled from great heights. Even those who survived often developed breathing problems, their lungs coated with soot long before they reached adolescence. Other children found work in factories, where their quick fingers were prized for delicate tasks. In textile mills, they crawled beneath wearing machines to clear lint and thread broken spindles, the wheels clattering dangerously close to their heads. In glassworks, they carried molten blobs from furnace to craftsman, the heat blistering their skin. In match factories, as we have seen, girls inhaled phosphorus fumes that ate away their jaws. Street labor was no kender. Boys and girls served as mudlarks, scavenging along the Thames at low tide for scraps of coal, rope, or nails. They waded barefoot in muck, glass cutting their feet, sewage soaking their clothes. Others became crossing sweepers, clearing filth from the paths of wealthier pedestrians in hopes of a tossed coin. Still others peddled newspapers, flowers, or matches, their thin voices crying out above the rattle of carriages. Then there were the pure, finders, often children, who gathered dog dung from the streets, selling it to tanneries for use in preparing leather. The work was foul and degrading, but it paid a few pennies. In the economy of survival, even dung could be turned into bread. Not all child labor was on the margins. Some families relied on steady, if grueling, apprenticeships. A boy might be bound to a blacksmith, learning to hammer metal for endless hours. A girl might be taken into a dressmaker's shop, stitching until her eyes blurred by lamplight. Apprenticeships at least offered skills, but they were long years of servitude, with little pay and heavy discipline. Schooling, for most, was out of reach. Though charities and reformers established ragged schools, where poor children might learn letters and numbers for free, attendance was often irregular. Hunger kept children at work rather than at desks. Parents, themselves struggling, could rarely afford to spare a child's wages for the sake of education. A few hours schooling might be tolerated, but survival demanded coins, not books. The dangers of child labor were many. Fingers lost to machines, limbs broken in mills, lungs blackened with coal dust. Some were crippled for life before reaching adulthood. Others died young, their bodies worn out by exhaustion and exposure. But beyond the physical toll was the theft of childhood itself. The games, laughter, and freedom exchanged for toil and fear. Yet, remarkably, children found ways to carve joy from hardship. Mudlarks laughed together as they waded through sludge, inventing contests to see who could find the largest scrap. Crossing, sweepers boasted of their earnings, dreaming of sweetmeats or a rare hot meal. Even in the darkest trades, children clung to one another, creating bonds of companionship that softened the weight of labor. The plight of working children stirred the hearts of reformers. Campaigners like Lord Shaftesbury pushed for laws to limit hours and improve conditions. Slowly, painfully, Parliament responded. Factory acts were passed, reducing working hours for children, setting minimum ages, and insisting on some measure of schooling. The reforms were uneven, and enforcement weak, but they marked a turning point. Still, for decades, the reality of child labor remained grim. Enforcement lagged behind legislation, and poverty drove families to hide their children's work. Inspectors were few, employers cunning, and hunger relentless. It was not until the end of the century that schooling became truly compulsory, and the sight of children bent in toil began to fade. For those who lived it, though, the scars endured. Men grown old would recall crawling through chimneys as boys, lungs wheezing with each breath. Women, their teeth ruined and hands crippled, traced their pain back to endless hours in match factories or laundries. Childhoods lost could never be regained, even when the laws at last acknowledged their worth. Close your eyes and picture a London street at dusk. A line of factory whistles fades into the fog, while barefoot children hurry home, baskets empty, pockets with only a few pennies clinking. Their faces are smudged with soot, their clothes ragged. One boy hums a tune to keep his sister's spirits up. Another chews a crust of bread saved from midday. Their laughter is faint but real, an ember of life that refuses to be extinguished. These were the little toilers of London, whose small bodies bore the weight of an empire. They were unseen by those who lived in wealth and comfort, yet their labor lit lamps, stoked fires, stitched garments, and carried goods that fed the prosperity of others. Childhood was their sacrifice, survival their only wage. If the workhouse was where the poor went in despair, then the gin palace was where they went in defiance. Bright, loud, and brazen, these establishments offered escape in liquid form. A glass of burning spirit that promised warmth against hunger, courage against misery, and forgetfulness against pain. Gin was not new to London. It had flowed through the city since the gin craze of the 18th century, when cheap spirits nearly drowned entire neighborhoods in drunkenness. By the Victorian era, the chaos of that earlier time had been reined in by law, but gin's grip on the poor remained strong. What had changed was the setting. no longer confined to dingy taverns or backroom stills. Jinn now reigned in grand establishments called Jinn palaces. They were dazzling places, meant to overwhelm the senses. Step through the door, and you were met with glittering mirrors, shining brass fittings, polished mahogany counters, and chandeliers that spilled light over every surface. Gas lamps burned brightly, banishing the gloom of London's foggy streets. The effect was theatrical, intoxicating before a single drop was drunk. For people who lived in narrow, dark rooms with peeling walls and cracked windows, the sudden blaze of color and light was itself a kind of intoxication. At the heart of it all was the bar. Long, sweeping counters stretched across the room, lined with gleaming taps and bottles of every size. Behind them stood rows of barmaids, brisk and smiling, their aprons crisp, their hands quick with the glasses. A penny or two was enough to purchase a dram, poured neat into small tumblers. No water to soften it, no food to slow it. The gin was raw, powerful, and immediate. The clientele was as mixed as the city itself. Dock workers fresh from the river stood beside factory girls with tired eyes. Soldiers on leave, hawkers, charwomen, beggars, and pickpockets, all crowded shoulder to shoulder, their voices raised in laughter, argument, or song. The air grew thick with smoke and sweat, with the sharp tang of spilled liquor soaking into the sawdust scattered across the floor. For many, gin was solace. A mother, worn thin by endless hours of washing, might cradle a glass as though it were her only friend, each sip easing the ache in her bones. A man, hungry and hopeless, found courage in the burning heat that slid down his throat. Children, shockingly, were not always excluded. Some were sent with jugs to be filled for parents. Others sneaked sips themselves, their young faces already hardened by the city's cruelties. But solace came with a price. Gin dulled hunger, yes, but it did not feed. It offered warmth, but only briefly, leaving the body colder still once its fire burned out. Dependence crept in silently, turning casual escape into daily necessity. Drunkenness became a common sight. Men staggering in the gutters, women slumped in doorways, children crying beside insensible parents. Domestic violence flared. Wages disappeared into the gin shops, and families slid deeper into misery. Reformers railed against the gin palaces. They described them as traps for the poor, glittering on the outside but destructive within. Temperance movements sprang up, urging abstinence, preaching sermons, distributing pamphlets. Campaigners like the Band of Hope sought to save children from a life of drink, gathering them into halls where pledges of sobriety were taken with trembling hands. For some, the message struck home. For many more, the lure of the glass remained irresistible. And yet, to understand the gin palace is to see not only vice, but longing. People were not drawn merely by the drink. They were drawn by the brightness, the bustle, the chance, however fleeting, to feel rich, to feel alive. The glittering mirrors reflected back faces that, for a brief moment, seemed part of something grander than the sooty, narrow streets outside. Picture it. A foggy evening in London, the lamps along the street barely piercing the haze. Then, ahead, a doorway blazes with golden light. You step inside, and the gloom falls away. Laughter crashes over you, the clink of glasses, the shout of a song begun at one end of the bar and taken up at the other. A coin presses into your palm. You hand it across. And soon the fire of gin is warming your chest. For a few minutes, the world feels different. It was this contrast, between the dull grind of poverty and the dazzling brightness of the gin palace, that gave the drink its power. It was escape, even if only for an hour, even if the morning brought hunger and regret. By the end of the century, beer houses and public houses had begun to overtake the gin palaces, offering milder drinks and, at times, food. Licensing laws tightened, and the great glittering palaces slowly dimmed. But in their heyday, they stood as symbols of both hope and ruin, their mirrors reflecting the restless faces of a city that could not decide whether to rise above its sorrows or drown them in spirits. The Gin Palace was London in a glass. Harsh, intoxicating, and impossible to ignore. If the Gin Palace was where the poor sought refuge in drink, the music hall was where they sought refuge in laughter. Amid the smoke, soot, and sorrow of London streets, these halls offered something rare: light, color, and sound. They were sanctuaries of merriment, crowded spaces where, for a few coins, one could forget the drudgery of life and be swept away by music and spectacle. The Victorian Music Hall was a world of its own. Part theatre, part tavern, part carnival. Some were humble, converted rooms above public houses, where a fiddler played while singers belted out comic songs. Others were grand establishments with gilded balconies, velvet curtains, and gaslight chandeliers, capable of seating hundreds. But whether large or small, they shared the same beating heart: the stage, brightly lit and bustling with energy. Here, performers of every kind took their turn. Comedians with sharp tongues poked fun at pompous politicians and the absurdities of everyday life. Singers warbled sentimental ballads that brought tears to the eyes of weary mothers. Jugglers tossed clubs and knives with astonishing precision, while acrobats tumbled across the boards in daring displays. The songs were catchy, the jokes broad, the dances lively, all designed to capture the attention of audiences who worked long hours and had little patience for subtlety. It was a noisy, chaotic affair. Patrons ate and drank throughout the show, clattering plates and shouting orders at the waiters. Beer flowed freely, and the smell of fried fish and strong tobacco filled the air. Conversation buzzed, punctuated by bursts of laughter, jeers, or applause. Unlike the refined silence of opera houses or concert halls, the music hall thrived on participation. Audiences sang along with choruses, shouted encouragements to favored performers, and sometimes heckled those who faltered. It was entertainment not delivered to the people, but shared with them. The most beloved performers became household names. Stars like Marie Lloyd, with her cheeky humor and saucy songs, drew crowds that packed the halls to bursting. Her playful winks and double meanings delighted working class men and women alike, while scandalizing polite society. Others specialized in sentimental tunes, their voices quivering with emotion as they sang of love lost, of sailors far from home, of mothers waiting at the door for children who never returned. These songs tugged at the heartstrings, reminding audiences that their struggles were not theirs alone, but part of a shared story. Children, too, found their way into the music halls, though reformers frowned at the idea. Penny gaffes, cheap entertainments held in small halls or makeshift venues, were especially popular with the young. For a penny, they could watch melodramas acted out with broad gestures and thrilling villains, or gape at exotic animals and curiosities. Parents might worry, moralists might scold, but for children living in cramped rooms and bleak alleys, the penny gaff was a world of wonder. Not everyone approved of these entertainments. Critics complained that the music halls encouraged idleness, drunkenness, and immorality. Religious reformers decried the bawdy songs and late-night revelry, insisting that such amusements led only to ruin. Yet despite sermons and pamphlets, the halls thrived. They were too deeply woven into the fabric of working class life, too vital as a release valve for a city under constant pressure. For many, a night at the music hall was more than just fun. It was survival of another kind. Laughter and song were medicines for weary souls, giving courage to rise again the next morning. A dockworker might spend his week straining under cargo, but on Saturday night, he could throw back his head and laugh until tears ran down his face. A seamstress might spend endless hours hunched over fabric, but for one evening, she could sing along with a chorus, her voice joining hundreds of others in unison. There was, too, a sense of community. The halls gathered people together across trades, families, and neighborhoods. In the laughter and the clapping, in the choruses sung loudly and off-key, there was a reminder that no one struggled entirely alone. life was harsh, but at least for a few hours, it could also be joyous. Picture such a night, the gaslights flare, casting a golden glow over the crowded hall. The stage curtain rises, and a comedian strides forward, his voice booming as he launches into a tale of bumbling policemen. The audience roars, pounding tables with fists, mugs sloshing with beer. A woman takes the stage next, her song teasing and playful, the crowd leaning forward to catch her every wink. Soon the hall is echoing with a chorus, hundreds of voices merging into one raucous, joyful noise. Outside, the fog presses close, the streets are dark and cold. But inside, the music hall blazes with warmth and laughter. In time, the music halls would evolve, paving the way for modern theatre, cinema, and popular entertainment. But in the heart of Victorian London, they were more than amusements. They were lifelines, fragile but vital, binding together a people who lived daily in hardship, but who refused to let go of joy. The music halls did not erase misery, but they offered something equally important: the chance to forget, to laugh, to sing, and, for a few precious hours, to feel human again. The streets of Victorian London were not only filled with the wary tread of workers and the cries of hawkers. In the dark alleys and crooked courts, another world thrived, one of thieves, swindlers, and gangs. Crime was not a shadowy rarity but a daily companion, woven into the fabric of city life. Poverty, hunger, and desperation pushed many toward it, while opportunity beckoned in every unguarded pocket, every careless step. To walk the alleys of Whitechapel or Southwark after dusk was to walk a gauntlet. Lanterns cast only thin pools of light, and fog crept in to blur every outline. Out of the mist might step a pickpocket, his fingers quick as a whisper. A child, ragged and barefoot, could dart forward, snatch a handkerchief or purse, and vanish into the warren of passages before a cry could be raised. Children were especially feared for this work. Their size and nimbleness made them invisible in a crowd. Their innocence a disguise sharper than any blade. At the heart of this petty thievery lay the rookeries. These were dense nests of tenements and courts, where narrow staircases wound upward like crooked ladders, and refuse clogged every corner. Within these warrens, stolen goods were hidden, broken down, or passed on to fences. Dealers who bought stolen items without questions. A stolen watch might change hands half a dozen times before finding its way back to a market stall, indistinguishable from any other. But not all crime was petty. Gangs roamed the streets, some with names that carried a kind of rough pride: the 40 Thieves, the Mohawks, the Scuttlers. They were made up of young men, hardened by hunger and shaped by the brutal lessons of the street. Armed with knives, bludgeons, or nothing more than fists, they carved out territories, guarding their corners and alleys with violence. Fights between rival groups could erupt suddenly, turning quiet lanes into battlegrounds of shouts, curses, and blood. For the unlucky passerby, a gang meant robbery at best, beating at worst. To stumble upon such a group in a dark alley was to feel the press of danger close and cold, a demand for coins, the flash of steel, the shove of rough hands. Many gave up what they carried, grateful to escape with life and limb intact. Yet crime in Victorian London was not always brutal. Some thieves were masters of cunning rather than force. Swindlers set elaborate traps, tricking the unwary with games of chance or false promises. Confidence men preyed upon trust, persuading strangers to hand over money with tales of urgent need or sure investment. Sharpers haunted fairs and markets, turning dice or cards with practiced deceit. For those who had nothing, wit could be as valuable as a weapon. Women, too, found themselves drawn into the shadows. Many, unable to find steady work, turned to prostitution, which was itself a precarious trade. Some supplemented it with theft, lifting wallets from distracted clients, or luring men into alleys where accomplices waited to rob them. Others worked as shoplifters, skirts specially sewn with hidden pockets to smuggle away ribbons, gloves, or trinkets. It was dangerous work, but in a city where starvation was always near, danger often mattered less than survival. The police, in their dark uniforms and tall helmets, tried to keep order, but their reach was limited. A constable patrolling the fog might catch a boy with his hand in a pocket, or stumble upon a brawl, but the rookeries swallowed more crime than they revealed. The labyrinth of alleys and courts was designed for vanishing. One moment a thief was in sight, the next he was gone, swallowed by the city itself. The law courts and prisons overflowed with those caught in the act. Newgate, Coldbath Fields, Pentonville, each name carried dread. Sentences ranged from a few days, hard labor to transportation across the sea, where convicts were shipped to colonies in Australia. For many petty thieves, exile was the final chapter of their London story, their lives uprooted and carried thousands of miles away. And yet, crime was not only born of desperation. For some, it became a way of life, even a source of grim pride. The thief who could pick a pocket in broad daylight, the burglar who could slip into a house without raising a sound, the gang leader who commanded respect with a glance. These figures carried a dark glamour in the underworld. Stories of their deeds spread through the rookeries like legend, whispered with admiration even as they were cursed by victims. But in the end, crime was as much a reflection of the city as any palace or factory. It grew out of poverty, out of inequality, out of streets too crowded and hearts too hungry. To condemn the thief was easy. To understand him required looking at the conditions that birthed him. In the rookeries where families slept 6 to a room, where food was scarce and work uncertain, crime was often not rebellion, but survival. Imagine now a quiet night in the East End. The fog drapes the cobbles in silence. A man hurries home, clutching his coat tight, the sound of his footsteps echoing between damp walls. He feels eyes on him, quick movement in the shadows. A figure slips past. Was that only a child? His hand goes to his pocket, and his heart lurches. Empty. He turns, but the alley is already empty too, the thief gone as though the mist itself had swallowed him whole. Such was London after dark, where crime walked as easily as any citizen, and the city itself seemed to conspire with those who lived by shadow. In the autumn of 1888, fear took a new shape in London's East End. The fog, the darkness, and the ever-present poverty were old companions. But now something darker walked the streets. A killer whose name would echo through history, Jack the Ripper. The East End was already a place of shadows. Narrow lanes twisted like tangled roots, courts opened suddenly into small, dim squares, and the gas lamps burned faintly through the thick fog. It was here, among the rookeries of Whitechapel, that the Ripper's grim work began. His victims were women, most of them poor, most of them struggling to survive through casual prostitution. Their lives had been marked by hardship long before they met their dreadful end, and their deaths, brutal and mysterious, cast a pall over the whole city. The murders began quietly enough, scarcely noticed beyond the slums. But as the killings grew in number and horror, London could no longer look away. Newspapers seized on the story, splashing lurid headlines across their front pages. Ghastly murder in Whitechapel, one declared, and the phrase was soon repeated in every household, from the meanest hovel to the grandest drawing room. Each new killing fed the panic. Women feared to walk alone at night. Men cast wary glances into the fog, certain that the killer might emerge from any shadow. The police patrolled the streets in greater numbers, their boots ringing on the cobbles, but the Ripper slipped past them like smoke. He struck with swift violence, then vanished, leaving behind only silence, terror, and the helpless bodies of his victims. The mystery of his identity gripped the public as much as the horror of his crimes. Was he a butcher, his skill with a knife honed on carcasses? Was he a doctor, using medical knowledge for dreadful ends? Some whispered of foreign sailors, others of aristocrats slumming in disguise. Theories blossomed in taverns and parlors alike, each more fanciful than the last. The Ripper was no longer just a killer. He was a phantom, an idea, a story that grew with each telling. The victims themselves, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly, were women who lived and died in the margins of society. Their names, barely recorded in life, became known in death, forever linked to the shadowy figure who ended their days. For the people of Whitechapel, the sorrow was immediate and raw. These were neighbors, familiar faces at lodging houses, voices once heard in crowded markets. Their deaths were not distant headlines, but painful absences in the narrow streets where they had walked. The police worked tirelessly, though often without success. Constables paced the alleys, detectives interviewed witnesses, and rewards were offered for information. Letters poured in, some claiming to be from the Ripper himself, their words taunting and cruel. Most were hoaxes, yet they deepened the sense of dread, for what kind of man would write such things, if not a monster? As weeks stretched into months, the fear did not fade. The East End seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next strike. Rumors spread quickly. Each scream in the night, each unexplained shadow, became the stuff of whispered speculation. Ordinary crimes, once overlooked, now took on sinister meaning. The fog itself seemed heavier, the darkness deeper, as though the city itself had absorbed the fear of its people. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, Jack the Ripper vanished. The killings ceased, though his name lingered like smoke in the air. No arrest was ever made, no identity ever confirmed. Theories persisted. Some insisted he fled the city, others that he died. Still others that he was someone powerful, shielded from the law. But the truth was lost, buried in the same fog that had concealed his crimes. In time, the East End returned to its harsh rhythms of labor, poverty, and survival. Yet something had changed. The Ripper's reign of terror had left scars, deeper than those carved by his knife. The women of Whitechapel knew their lives could be ended at any moment. Their names remembered only for the horror of their deaths. The men of the city knew, too, that violence could walk unseen beside them, its face hidden forever. But if Jack the Ripper was a figure of terror, he was also a mirror held up to Victorian society. His crimes forced London to confront the conditions in which his victims lived. The poverty, the desperation, the invisibility of the poor. For a moment, the world looked into the alleys it had long ignored. And though the fear faded, the questions lingered, unresolved, like the fog that still rolls over the East End on autumn nights. Picture it now: a narrow street, silent, but for the drip of rain. A woman hurries through the fog, her shawl pulled tight, her footsteps quick. Behind her, the echo of another step. She glances back, but the mist hides all. Ahead, a faint lamp burns, but the shadows stretch long. She walks faster, her heart thudding in the silence. Then the fog closes in, and nothing more is seen. Jack the Ripper is gone, yet his legend remains, a spectre that haunts London still. If crime was the pulse of London's darker side, then the police were its uneasy heartbeat, steady in appearance, but often faltering beneath the surface. The Metropolitan Police, formed in 1829 under Sir Robert Peel, were still a relatively young institution in the Victorian era. Their tall helmets and dark blue uniforms made them instantly recognizable, a symbol of order amid the chaos of the streets. But to the people of London, especially in the East End, they were not always symbols of safety. Sometimes they were seen as guardians, other times as nuisances, and often as powerless. The task before them was daunting. Imagine a city teeming with millions, its alleys twisting like a labyrinth, its rookeries crowded with desperate souls. The fog alone was enemy enough, blinding constables on patrol, muffling sound, swallowing shadows whole. Add to this the sheer scale of poverty, the constant flow of migrants seeking work, the ever-present underworld of thieves, fences, and gangs, and one could see how impossible the task of true order seemed. The beat constable was the backbone of the force. He walked his patch with steady steps, lantern swinging in hand, eyes and ears alert for trouble. His duties ranged from the serious to the mundane, breaking up drunken brawls outside gin shops, helping lost children find their way, moving on loiterers, or simply striking the hour with his truncheon against the paving stones. Yet his authority was fragile. Alone in the dark, outnumbered by gangs or mocked by jeering crowds, a constable might feel less like a keeper of peace and more like a solitary figure in a city too vast to control. When serious crimes occurred, burglary, murder, organized theft, the detective branch was called upon. These plainclothes officers, often distrusted at first for their secrecy, became the forerunners of modern investigation. They carried notebooks instead of lanterns, gathered statements, followed trails of evidence. Some gained reputations for brilliance, while others struggled in the face of a public eager for justice, but unwilling to grant patience. In sensational cases like the hunt for Jack the Ripper, detectives found themselves under immense pressure, their every move scrutinized by newspapers, hungry for scandal. Yet for all their efforts, the police were often reactive rather than preventative. A crime would occur, a victim would fall, and only then would the machinery of investigation grind into motion. Prevention was far harder. How could one stop a pickpocket in a crowd of thousands, or anticipate a quarrel that would turn to violence in the blink of an eye? The constable's very presence was meant to deter wrongdoing, but in many parts of London, hunger and desperation outweighed fear of the law. The relationship between the police and the public was complicated. To respectable citizens, especially in the wealthier districts, they were reassuring, a nightly presence that gave a sense of calm. But among the poor, the police were sometimes resented as enforcers of laws that punished poverty more harshly than wealth. A woman selling matches without a license might be arrested, while a gentleman's misdeeds went unremarked. Drunkenness, loitering, petty theft, all could bring down the heavy hand of the law, while larger injustices, like dangerous factory conditions or slum landlords, often went unchallenged. Corruption, too, played its part. Though many officers were honest men, others were tempted by bribes, whether from publicans, gamblers, or crime bosses eager to keep their trades unmolested. Scandals occasionally burst into the open, shaking public faith and fueling suspicion that the police were less protectors than pawns in a larger game. And yet, there were moments of quiet heroism. A constable guiding a lost child through the fog, his lantern held high. A detective piecing together clues with patient determination, seeking justice for the forgotten. A patrolman stepping between fighting men, risking injury to restore peace. These were not the stories that filled newspapers, but they were the daily fabric of the force. The small acts that prevented chaos from consuming the city entirely. The figure of the detective also began to capture the public imagination. Fictional creations like Charles Dickens's Inspector Bucket in Bleak House or Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes reflected both admiration and longing for order. People wished for detectives who could see through fog and lies, who could uncover truth where all else was confusion. Real detectives could rarely live up to such ideals, but the very existence of these characters showed the hunger for certainty in a world of shadows. Picture, if you will, a constable on his beat in Whitechapel. The fog curls around him, the gas lamps faint and wavering. His boots sound steady on the stones, but his heart is uneasy. Ahead, a group of youths scatter at the sight of his figure, laughter trailing behind them. He pauses, listening. Somewhere a cry rings out, sharp and fleeting, swallowed by the mist. He quickens his step, but by the time he reaches the alley, it is empty, only silence, and the drip of water from the eaves. He makes a note in his book, adjusts his lantern, and walks on. The city sleeps uneasily, but it sleeps. In the end, the Victorian police were not all powerful. nor entirely powerless. They were men set against the tide of a restless, growing city, doing what they could with the tools of their time. Order and chaos existed side by side, as inseparable as fog and lamplight, each defining the other. And through it all, the watchful figure of the constable remained, pacing steadily through the night, a small but enduring symbol of the struggle to keep darkness at bay. London in the Victorian age was a city of breathless growth, its population swelling beyond the capacity of its streets, houses, and drains. With people came noise, with noise came industry, and with industry came smoke, filth, and an endless tide of waste. And in that waste lurked invisible enemies, diseases that crept silently through the city, striking rich and poor alike, but falling hardest upon the poor. Foremost among these specters was cholera. It came in waves, sudden and brutal, sweeping through crowded neighborhoods with merciless speed. One moment a man might seem well. Hours later he lay shrunken and pale, his body drained of life as though the disease itself had stolen the very water from his veins. Families huddled in fear, watching helplessly as loved ones were taken within a single day. The cause of cholera was not understood at first. Many believed it spread through foul air, the infamous miasma. And in truth, the air of London was foul enough, thick with coal smoke and the stench of sewage. But the true culprit was water, fouled by the very sewers meant to carry waste away. The great cholera outbreaks revealed the hidden poison flowing beneath the city, though the truth would only be uncovered slowly, through the persistence of men like Dr. John Snow. If cholera was swift, typhus was insidious. It thrived where filth and overcrowding prevailed, lodging houses, prisons, workhouses. Carried by lice, it spread quietly until fever, rashes, and delirium marked its victims. Whole families might be struck down in a single dwelling, their bodies weakened by hunger and exhaustion, their chances of survival slim. The poor knew its grip all too well, though they often called it jail fever, for it was notorious in the city's prisons. Typhus seemed almost a punishment for poverty itself, a disease born of squalor, passed among those who had no choice but to live in it. Then there was consumption, what we now call tuberculosis. Unlike the sudden violence of cholera, consumption was a slow thief. It stole breath by breath, day by day, hollowing cheeks and whitening skin, until sufferers became shadows of themselves. It was a strangely romanticized disease in the Victorian imagination, its victims often described as pale, delicate, almost ethereal. But for those who endured it, there was nothing poetic in the long coughing fits, the blood on the handkerchief, the slow wasting of strength. It touched rich and poor alike, though the crowded tenements of the East End provided fertile ground for its spread. Many families lost more than one member to its lingering cruelty. Death was an everyday companion in London. In wealthy houses, mourning was marked with black crepe, solemn funerals, and elaborate rituals. In the slums, death was simpler but no less devastating. A body wrapped, a pauper's coffin nailed shut, a hurried burial in a crowded graveyard. Children died often, their lives snuffed out before they had begun. Parents carried their grief silently, for it was so common that even sorrow became a routine of survival. Yet each loss was keenly felt, a reminder that life was fragile, uncertain, and often cruel. The fear of disease shaped the rhythm of the city. Families avoided certain streets, rumored to be cursed with illness. Wealthier citizens fled during outbreaks, retreating to the countryside where the air seemed cleaner and the risk less. Hospitals, once feared as places where the poor went to die, began to change slowly. As medical science advanced, sanitation reforms, driven by both compassion and necessity, brought improvements: new sewer systems, cleaner water supplies, public health boards. Yet progress was slow, and always the poorest bore the brunt of delay. Picture, if you will, a tenement room in Whitechapel. A mother bends over her child, whose small body trembles with fever. The air is heavy, damp with the breath of too many crammed together. Outside, a cart rumbles past, its wheels splashing through the refuse in the gutter. She dips a cloth in water to cool the child's brow, not knowing that the water itself may be poison. Across the hall, another neighbor coughs, a deep, rattling cough that echoes through the thin walls. The mother prays, not for riches, not even for rest, but only for one more day, one more chance to keep her child alive. Disease was not merely a medical matter, it was a mirror of society. Cholera revealed the hidden dangers of poor sanitation. Typhus exposed the misery of overcrowding. Consumption showed how poverty weakened the body, until illness could not be resisted. Each epidemic forced London to confront its own failures, to see, in the suffering of its people, the cost of neglect. Yet even amid fear, there was resilience. Families nursed one another with what little means they had. Neighbors shared food, water, or simple acts of kindness. Doctors and reformers pushed forward, however slowly, toward better understanding and prevention. Out of the darkness of disease came the beginnings of modern public health, the recognition that the well, being of one was bound to the well, being of all. And still the fog rolled in, heavy with soot and smoke, blending with the odors of refuse and sickness. To walk through a London street at night was to breathe in the city itself, a mixture of life and death, vigor and decay. In every cough that echoed through the alleys, in every hastily nailed coffin, the reality of disease lingered. It was a reminder that for all its grandeur, for all its industry and ambition, London was a city forever haunted by the spectre of death. In the heart of Victorian London, where illness seemed to linger in every damp room and crooked alley, medicine stood at a crossroads. The city's doctors and healers, both real and self-proclaimed, offered a bewildering array of cures. Some were rooted in science, others in superstition, and still others in sheer deception. For the poor and desperate, any promise of relief, no matter how dubious, was a light in the gloom. The medical profession itself was far from uniform. Some physicians had studied at prestigious universities, armed with knowledge of anatomy and emerging ideas about germs. Others were apothecaries, skilled in the mixing of tinctures, powders, and herbal brews. Surgeons, still regarded by many as little more than skilled butchers, plied their trade with saws and scalpels, often without the benefit of anesthesia, until the mid-century. The practice of medicine was changing, but slowly, and not everyone welcomed the new ideas. Among the most common remedies were those of the apothecaries. Their shops, with shelves lined with jars of dried herbs and brightly colored liquids, were both comforting and mysterious. Customers might leave with laudanum, a powerful mixture of opium and alcohol, prescribed as readily for sleeplessness as for a cough or an aching tooth. Mothers gave it to restless children, not knowing how addictive or dangerous it could be. For pain, there was chloroform or morphine, potent and effective, yet shadowed with risks. But for every cautious apothecary, there was also the street quack. These self-styled doctors set up stalls at markets or roamed the streets with carts laden with bottles of miracle tonics. Their cries echoed above the noise of the crowd. Elixir of life! Guaranteed to cure all ills! These concoctions often contained little more than colored water, cheap alcohol, or herbs of questionable origin. Yet their appeal was strong. To the weary laborer coughing from consumption, or the mother watching her child waste away, hope was worth a few pennies, even if it came corked in a bottle of lies. Superstition still held sway in many quarters of the city. Some believed disease was carried by bad air alone, the dreaded miasma, and so placed bowls of vinegar or bunches of herbs in their homes, hoping to purify the air. Others clung to old folk remedies, onion poultices pressed to the chest, mustard plasters for fever, goose fat rubbed on aching joints. In dimly lit rooms, whispers of charms, prayers and talismans persisted, remnants of a time when medicine and magic were entwined. Yet alongside quackery and superstition, true progress was unfolding. The Victorian era was one of discovery, where science began to lift the veil of ignorance. The work of men like Dr. John Snow, who traced cholera to contaminated water, laid the foundation for modern epidemiology. Joseph Lister introduced antiseptic techniques to surgery, reducing the deadly infections that had once seemed inevitable after an operation. Vaccination, first pioneered in the previous century, became more widely adopted, offering protection against smallpox. These advances did not come without resistance. Many distrusted new methods, fearing they interfered with the natural order or carried hidden dangers. Hospitals, too, began to transform. Once dreaded as places of last resort, they grew cleaner and more organized. Nurses, inspired by the example of Florence Nightingale, brought compassion and discipline to their work, though conditions remained harsh. Still, for many of the poor, the hospital was not an option. They relied on charity clinics, friendly societies, or their own ingenuity to survive illness. Consider a woman in the East End, tending to her husband as he coughs through the night. She has no money for a doctor, no savings for medicine. Instead, she brews a tea of chamomile and honey, soothing if not curative. She rubs his chest with camphorated oil, murmuring that it will help him breathe easier. In her pocket, she keeps a small vial of patent medicine purchased from a market quack, just in case. She does not know if it will work, but hope itself is part of the cure. The line between healer and fraud was not always clear. Some quacks believed in their remedies as much as their customers did. Others preyed deliberately on desperation. Advertisements filled the newspapers with bold promises: pills to restore vitality, tonics to lengthen life, syrups to ease every complaint. The words were persuasive, the testimonials glowing, though rarely true. Regulation was weak, and countless fortunes were made selling illusions of health. Even so, the march of science pressed forward. Laboratories buzzed with new ideas. Microscopes revealed hidden worlds, and slowly the notion of invisible germs gained ground. By the end of the century, the understanding of disease had shifted profoundly. No longer was illness seen solely as a curse of bad air or weak constitution, but as something that could be studied, fought, and perhaps one day conquered. Still, for the ordinary Londoner, these changes came slowly, unevenly, and often too late. Quacks continued to hawk their cures, mothers still whispered old remedies, and suffering remained a constant companion. Yet in the clash between superstition and science, between fraud and discovery, the roots of modern medicine were laid down. The city, bruised and weary though it was, became a crucible where the old ways gave way to the new. And so, amid the gaslit streets and the fog, one could hear two voices, at once the cries of the quack selling miracle tonics to the desperate, and the steady assurances of doctors and reformers determined to uncover the truth. Between them lay the fragile hopes of millions, clinging to whatever promise of healing they could find in a world where disease never slept. The fog still lingers over Victorian London in memory, even now. When we imagine the city of the 19th century, we see it not in bright daylight, but in a twilight of coal smoke and drifting haze, where gas lamps flickered uncertainly, and the streets twisted like veins through a great, restless body. Within those streets lived millions of souls, each carrying their own struggles, hopes, and fears. The story of London in that age was one of contrasts, palaces rising in grandeur, even as slums decayed in filth, great inventions illuminating the world, even as poverty and disease snuffed out countless lives. It was a city of triumphs and tragedies, and its spirit was forged in the uneasy balance between them. For those who lived in its poorer quarters, life was a battle against hunger, cold, and sickness. Yet within that hardship, there was also resilience, a stubborn endurance that allowed them to carry on through the long nights and uncertain days. The poor mudlark searching the river's edge for scraps, The match girl coughing in a factory clouded with phosphorus fumes. The docker straining beneath the weight of a heavy load. All of them were part of a larger story. Their lives, though often unrecorded, shaped the city as surely as the architects and politicians did. The splendor of the empire, the wealth displayed in crystal palaces and glittering halls, rested upon the weary shoulders of those who toiled in obscurity. Death was a constant companion in Victorian London, yet it did not silence the living. Families mourned their children and carried on. Neighbors buried their dead and then shared food, laughter, and small joys with one another. Even in the shadow of disease and deprivation, there were bonds of community, kindnesses exchanged, and moments of light in the darkness. To walk through the fog was to sense not only misery, but also the quiet strength of survival. Reformers, too, rose from these streets, men and women who refused to accept suffering as inevitable. Their efforts, sometimes met with resistance or ridicule, planted the seeds of change. Cleaner water, safer factories, the beginnings of public health and social welfare. The London of the late 19th century was not the same city as it had been at the dawn of Victoria's reign. Though the poor still struggled, progress had been made, and the path toward a more humane society was being laid. Looking back, it is easy to dwell on the horrors, the rookeries of Whitechapel, the terrors of Jack the Ripper, the hunger, the disease. Yet there is another truth as well. These hardships brought into sharper relief the courage of those who endured them. In their endurance, we glimpse the unbreakable thread of humanity that ties past to present. Their struggles remind us that cities are not just bricks and mortar, but living stories, shaped by the countless ordinary lives within them. Now imagine, once more, walking through a foggy London night. The gas lamps flicker, the cobblestones glisten with damp, and the air carries the mingled scents of smoke, refuse, and river water. A carriage rattles past, its horse's hooves echoing in the narrow street. Somewhere nearby, a child's laughter rings out, defiant against the gloom. Further along, a church bell tolls the hour, solemn and steady. In that soundscape, we can still feel the heartbeat of the city. It is a rhythm of hardship, yes, but also of perseverance, of families gathering around meager fires, of neighbors sharing news and song, of workers dreaming, however faintly, of something better. The city story is not just one of suffering, but of survival. And so, as the fog thickens and night deepens, we step back from those narrow alleys and crowded rooms, from the workhouses and gin shops, from the docks and factories. We leave behind the cries of hawkers, and the clang of machinery, the whispers of reformers, and the murmurs of the sick. What remains is a quiet reflection, a recognition that life in Victorian London was hard, often brutally so, yet it was lived with a resilience that speaks across time. The people of that age did not know the future we know now. The advances in medicine, the reforms in labor, the improvements in living conditions. They knew only their present, their own fog-shrouded streets. Yet in walking them, they laid the path that would lead to those changes. Their endurance is their legacy, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, life continues and hope, however fragile, persists. As we close this journey through Victorian London, let the images fade gently, the gaslight dimming, the fog rolling in once more, the footsteps on cobblestones receding into silence. The city becomes a memory, softened by time, its edges blurred like shadows in the mist. What remains is a feeling, a lingering sense of lives once lived, of struggles and triumphs that shaped the world we know today. And in that quiet reflection, perhaps there is comfort. For though their world was harsh, their spirit endures, whispering through history like the fog that still drifts over the Thames on a cool, autumn night.